I guess it automatically begins recording. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to go over just a couple of technical pieces of information. This is my first time using the webinar function of Zoom, so your patience is greatly appreciated. First, I want to say that there is captioning occurring. To turn it on, you need to go to the bottom of your screen where there's a little box that says CC. If you click on that box, you'll have the option to either have subtitles on the screen or a live transcript on the side of your screen. If you have any technical issues or questions, please direct them to the panelists using the chat function, and we'll attempt to help you. Also, if you have any questions for the panelists as the event comes tonight, the best way to direct questions to the panelists is to use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's event is part of the Bread and Roses Center Feminist Research Colloquium at San Diego State University Women's Studies Department. It's part of our speaker series on feminist disability justice. I'd like to thank the San Diego State University College of Arts and Letters for sponsoring this event tonight. I want to open the event with a land acknowledgement for San Diego State University. And I know that our panelists are also joining us from other locations and will be giving their own land acknowledgements. The acknowledgement for San Diego State University was composed by Mike Connolly Misquish. And the short version is, for millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. And I also want to affirm that land acknowledgements are important, but also inadequate to the work of decolonization. The event tonight, first I want to thank our interpreters for the event tonight. Our Jojo is on the screen right now, and Ketara will be popping in later. Thank you to our ASL interpreters tonight. The event tonight, it offers a critical disability perspective on policing, criminalization, and incarceration. It's part of the conversation that was ignited last fall, late spring, early summer, a call for racial justice, a renewed conversation about the violence of policing, criminalization, and incarceration in the United States. And the conversation today contributes to this. How can we bring disabled people of color, disabled queer and trans people, and disabled working class and rural people into the analysis of criminalization, policing, and incarceration? Our guests, Liat Ben-Moshe and Subini Annamma, have both contributed extensive and exciting scholarship towards this question, highlighting how disabled people, past and present, have resisted criminalization and organized to end their confinements. The discussion will also explore how we can apply abolitionist and critical disability perspectives to push for equity in public policy. So I want to introduce our moderator tonight, Megan Welsh. She's an associate professor in the School of Public Affairs here at San Diego State University, where she teaches courses on research methods and data analysis for social scientists, as well as special topics courses on homelessness and racial and gender injustice. Megan is trained as both a social worker and a criminologist and brings these perspectives to her scholarship. The main goal of her research is to inform community-based responses to poverty and criminal legal contact that are rooted in people's wisdom about their own lives, needs, and humanity. Her current research focuses on the health and sanitation needs of people experiencing homelessness, the criminalization of poverty, and racialized policing. I'll now turn it over to Megan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Jess, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much to our esteemed featured guests. And special thanks to the folks who are making this event happen, especially Jess, who has been working on this behind the scenes for months. I just want to say a few things to frame our conversation here today, which I am so looking forward to witnessing. First, I want to highlight that yesterday evening, 8 people were killed at 3 separate spas in North Georgia. 6 of the people killed were Asian, and all but 1 were women. We want to amplify the words of Stephanie Cho, Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Atlanta, who stated in a press release today that we are heartbroken by these acts of violence. 6 Asian women lost their lives. Now is the time to hold the victims and their families in our hearts and in our light. We're calling on our allies across communities of color to stand with us in grief and solidarity against racist violence in all its forms. When our most vulnerable community members are targeted, we all need to band together. I also want to highlight a tragedy that happened here in our local San Diego community this week. On Monday morning, an impaired driver drove into a homeless encampment as folks were huddled together, trying to avoid the rain in the B Street tunnel at San Diego City College. The driver stayed on location and tried to assist in the wreckage of the aftermath until he was arrested. 3 people were killed and several others were injured. The violence here is in why people are unhoused in our society, why unsheltered folks were concentrated in one location to avoid the weather, to avoid our temporary shelter system, which many view as less safe than living on the streets, and to avoid the police enforcement, the rampant and relentless criminalization of homelessness that has pushed them there. These instances of direct interpersonal and institutional violence and neglect are unacceptable and heartbreaking. They highlight the importance of why we are here today. Lastly, as we note the 1-year anniversary today of SDSU shutting down our campus and going online due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I also want to state at the outset here that we've made a deliberate decision to frame our conversation today somewhat outside of the pandemic. Many of us who are working, writing, thinking, teaching, and learning about social justice in this time, we've reached a saturation point with conversations about the pandemic to some extent. We are hungry to talk and think and write and teach about what comes next. What is the future that we can build together? Both of the scholars that we are so honored to hear from today are leading abolitionist thinkers. They help us to see the ways in which our current societal structures reinforce a narrative of difference and impose a devastatingly harsh criminal legal system on people who are labeled different and thereby deviant in our society. Our conversation today is going to unpack abolition, feminism, intersectionality, discrit, and related frameworks for seeing, naming, and working to eliminate criminalization and pathologization. So first, we're going to hear our panelists' thoughts about feminist abolition. So thank you again to Liat and Subini for being here with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you both now. And so our first question to start us off today is about feminist abolition. What does it mean to you? And or why, how do abolitionists need feminist abolitionist frameworks, critical disability frameworks, and why do scholars and activists working within each of these realms really need to be talking to each other in this moment?
Liat, would you like to start?
Sure, I don't mind starting. So let me start by thanking our hosts and our hosts at SDSU and the interpreter and the captioning that seems to be having a little bit of difficulty today, and everybody who worked behind the scenes to bring us together. And I just want to say, up front, because before I introduce myself and describe myself, that Subini and I have known each other for quite a while, and it's really such a pleasure to be with you. I wish it was more in person. We can go out to dinner with the other attendees as well and our hosts. But I've been really looking forward to this conversation that draws us together, because I've been, as you know, really building on your work, and I think our work and activism is, meshed together in ways that are really important. So I just want to thank you for your work and for being here as well. So let me just self-describe myself. So my name is Liat Ben-Moshe. I'm a white person, kind of look slightly, I don't know, beige today. Behind me is a beige, light yellow background with concentric circles in green. And this is the cover of my book, Decarcerating Disability. I'm wearing glasses and a lipstick, and my hair is pandemic gray. Which is a new phenomena, which I really like. And I'm wearing a black shirt. And I also want to acknowledge that whilst I'm talking to you, I am in Chicago. And Chicago resides on the traditional territories of the three Fire peoples, which are the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. And by making this land acknowledgement, I recognize that Indigenous people are the traditional stewards of the land that I occupy here, and have lived here long before Chicago was a city, and that many are still thriving and living here today. I also want to acknowledge, in relation to what Megan was talking about, that I live in part of the city called Uptown, and I live in a street that's next to Argyle. And Argyle is famously known as Little Asia, and there's a big graffiti on it that says Asia on Argyle. It's been historically a big Vietnamese community, Chinese community that lives in this area that now I live in. And so this is really important for me to share, because the kind of anti-Asian hatred that we've seen last night in Atlanta is something that we've been seeing in a lot of cities around the country, including here, of course, in Chicago, and something that, is right here in my neighborhood. I'm not Asian myself, but it's something that I'm very kind of intimately connected with, and I want to acknowledge that it's not in one locale only, and I hope we get to talk about it more today. So I want to address Megan's wonderful question about feminist abolition, and I think that it's, of course, not a coincidence that we have been summoned here, Subini and I, by a gender studies department, to be asked this question around feminist abolition. Because of course there is no abolition worthwhile that is not feminist and that is not intersectional. And that is something that, of course, I take from Subini's work, from Beth Ritchie's work. Ritchie is R-I-C-H-I-E, from Angela Davis's work, and a host of particularly Black feminists. So to me, abolition is feminist because it centers the margins. It brings the margins to the center. And a lot of my work has been in trying to understand various points in the history of disability and madness, and in the movements of people who are mad, neurodivergent, and disabled, as having kind of abolition currents or undercurrents sometimes. So my understanding of abolition absolutely comes from feminism, particularly Black feminist thought. It also comes from movements, disability movements. And within those disability movements, one of the things that I've seen is the centering of the margins, or moving the margins to the center, which is, of course, Bell Hooks' kind of very famous pedagogical and theoretical underpinning. And what I've seen is that if we start from the margins, for example, in deinstitutionalization, which is something I write about a lot, if we start from the margins, from the people who are most affected, the people who sometimes in the literature we call most severe, or in eugenics, uneducable, all of those categories, most dangerous, sometimes what we call non-nons in the prison arena. Non meaning not sexual offenders, not serious offenders, and not violent offenders. But if we start not from that, if we start from the quote unquote most dangerous, most serious, we find that that leads us to a path of liberation that is very different. And to me, that is a feminist understanding. It's an understanding that's rooted in intersectionality, and really shows us that the path to abolition is really this, and this is also a queer understanding, I should also say. It's this like refusal to wait. It's a refusal to wait, to start with the lesser cases. It's a refusal of that hierarchy to begin with. And to me, that is really important. The second thing, why I think it's important to anchor this in feminism also, is because of what I call disepistemology, DIS epistemology. And what I mean by this is letting go of certain ways of knowing. So it's not just about changing the framework of what we're talking about. It's actually letting go of certain ideas. And very connected to Sarah Ahmed, AHMED, idea of the feminist killjoy, right? It's about really anchoring our understanding in what do we need to unlearn, but more than that, letting go of this idea that there's experts, for example, who are going to tell us how to do abolition, how to get rid of carceral enclosures, how to liberate ourselves. We need to relinquish this idea of it will get better no matter what. We need to relinquish this idea that there's only one pathway to liberation. If somebody does something wrong, quote unquote, we call the cops. These are what I'm saying is that these are carceral logics that we sometimes follow even in our pathway to liberation. And what feminist abolitionists taught me is not to follow that pathway and to kind of disrupt it. Why we need it in terms of disability, and then I'll end. I mean, I think this is exactly, our conversation, right? I mean, to me, discussing mass incarceration, discussing abolition without disability is incredibly not just problematic scholarly wise, it's dangerous because it leads us to pathway that ends up being really not only ableist, but also disabling and don't actually, first of all, they're not anchored in the lived experience of disabled and mad and neurodivergent people. Then secondly, they don't understand disability or madness as a lived reality, as a way to view the world, as a way to analyze what we need to do. And then we don't look at things like the movements of people with disabilities that are pushing for a particular idea or disability justice, for example, particular ideas of liberation. And the reason why I think it's dangerous is because it lands us in this kind of solution-based, non-feminist kind of reform idea of, well, instead of the cops, let's bring social workers, right? Instead of police and prisons, what we need is more treatment for people with mental, quote unquote, mental illness. Instead of understanding really the complexity of madness, of disability from the lived experience of people who critique things like psychiatry or biopsychiatry, and instead call for these frameworks as if they are liberatory. So this is why I think it's not just an omission, it's actually very dangerous. But also vice versa, I think within disability movements, if we don't talk about incarceration, if we don't understand our brothers and sisters as people who are in these carceral sites, and ourselves also, and our brothers and sisters as people who are subjected to state violence and to carceral logics, then our struggles are very are going to be very unidimensional, and they can't grasp then the complexity of how racism and how patriarchy and capitalism are part of the problem of that we're facing. This is what brings us to policing, to criminalization, to incarceration, and so on.
Woo! I could just sit here and listen to Liat talk because I just learned so much when I get to be in conversation with you. So first of all, I want to thank everybody, particularly Jess and Megan, for inviting me to be in conversation. And also I want to thank you, Liat, for taking the time, because I really want people to understand what a true model of scholarship and generosity for me you have been, both professionally and personally. And that's not always true of our favorite critical scholars, right? So I want to just acknowledge your amazing humanity as well. I want to thank the interpreters, both Jojo and Katora, I hope I'm saying your name right, for the accessibility you're creating in this moment. I also want to acknowledge that San Francisco is on the lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, both historically and into the present day. Currently, I honor the Mwekma Ohlone tribe, who are campaigning to become federally recognized, along with the Association of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are researching, revitalizing, and preserving Ohlone history and culture. So always remembering that they persevere and are on the land in this current moment. I know it's been done already, but I also want to recognize the 6 Asian women that were murdered in Atlanta, and recognize what Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, Gilmore, calls the death-dealing violence of racism that is being borne by groups who don't serve the white supremacist patriarchal status quo. So I just want to hold everyone for a minute. I identify as both Black and Asian, and so my communities are hurting today. I think many communities of color are hurting today. I think women of color in particular are hurting today about how unsafe we've been feeling for, of course, throughout history, but these last few years have definitely exacerbated that for a lot of us. So it leads into the question of what does feminist abolition mean to you? And like Liat, I want to be really clear that I draw from a Black feminist abolition ways of knowing, and that's in direct opposition to what is often termed white feminism that centers the issues and needs of middle-class white women. So for me, that means we remove punishment from the center of our thinking, not only because it is ineffective, but also because it is dehumanizing. And I want to just pause here and note that in conversations about abolition, right, which are suddenly picking up, and I want to be clear that I don't consider myself an abolitionist leader. And in fact, I sometimes call myself a baby abolitionist, because I want to be really clear that that task of removing punishment from the center of our thinking is not one that everybody just can jump into like that. I've been working with incarcerated youth for most of my adult life, and I know how bad prisons are, and I still struggle with this. And so if you're here today trying to figure out what abolition is, or trying to figure out how you're thinking about it, that's okay. We want to be in conversation with you while we're thinking about it together, because it's not a straight line. It's not a clear line. It's a complicated way of figuring out how to think about the world when we've been taught from the jump and from the foundation of our country, and from much further back than that even, that that punishment is the only way to get people to do the things we want them to do. So for instance, Black feminist abolition knows that police are not the answer to that death-dealing violence of racism and white supremacy, whether structural or individual, because we know that they do not keep us safe. And I don't know how anyone can watch the press conference of a police officer today explaining that a white man just had a bad day, and that's why he killed 8 people. And he really isn't racist. It's not a racist motivation, but he managed to murder 6 Asian women. So I can't think of any clear call for abolition than watching that press conference. For so many of us, I think our blood pressure shot up. And it was both heartbreaking, not because it's unexpected anymore, but heartbreaking because it's so clear how unwanted we are at times. And yet at the same time enraging. So I just want to recognize that. But moreover, we recognize that prisons do not rehabilitate people. And so if we do not pretend that they do, then the only purpose prison serves is what Angela Davis calls an ideological dumping ground for the unwanted. And so really we have to think about both what we want to tear down, right? Which is all of these ways that we've integrated punishment into our society through police, through prisons, through multiple ways that we can talk about, but also what we are going to build in response to fight the racist, cis, hetero, patriarchal, ableist, xenophobic that undergirds our entire system. So in other words, as learning from Robin D.G. Kelly and some other people, that we need to think about how we freedom dream what we build instead. And so I always want to remind myself of that as an abolitionist, or even a baby abolitionist, is that we're always thinking about what we build, what we replace the system with. Not that we have to have immediate answers. I don't want to, but I want to dream about what kind of world we could have. Disability scholars need abolition because, at least in the field of education that I'm in, it's traditionally been built on deficit of what one cannot do, of fixing and remediating. So even when the take has been more critical, recognizing disabled youth as a marginalized population, when there is a question of bullying or harassment of disabled kids or any kind of harm, the answer is very often a reliance on structures, whether it be policies or punishments, using labeling, surveillance, and punishment as a way to pathologize others. That is because those responses are often rooted in white supremacy and a trust of a system that sustains it. So what if we stop relying on white supremacy to dictate our response to the harm of disabled and marginalized youth? And then this will be the last thing I say in this thing. I know long, but these first answers are long. But abolitionists need disability justice, a term I want to be clear that I'm drawing from Patty Byrne, B-E-R-N-E, and the group Sins Invalid, as a way of knowing that disrupts intersectional oppression, including racism, ableism, cis-hetero patriarchy. And if you go to the Sins Invalid website, they actually give you the constructs or the tenets of disability justice. But the reason abolitionists need that is because, similar to what Liat said, if we're not careful, we will reproduce the same harms the system is already creating if we don't address ableism. And again, for me, it's always the way racism and ableism are interdependent. They rely on each other. So we miss the ways that, so a great example, again, in education, because that's where I'm rooted. A lot of people are talking about learning loss right now and learning loss of the pandemic and kids being out of school for the year. And yes, that is important, but it's also a very particular way to understand the world, right? Because kids have also learned a lot this year. Not all good things, but they have learned a lot. And so this learning loss is really just this focus on, whatever made up constructs that we've decided now that they're behind on, right? So a lot of critical scholars are saying, hey, look at the ways we're talking about learning loss and realize that those are just kind of made up ideas. So if that's the case, and then I keep stepping in and saying yes, and remember that learning loss is the whole, is part of the current justification of special education, which we have an overrepresentation of Black and brown kids in emotional disabled categories and learning disabled categories and cognitive disabled categories, right? We have all of this overrepresentation of Black and brown kids. And with the whole premise that they have to have remedial curriculum to catch up on that learning loss. So again, if we could integrate ableism into our critiques of the system, I think we'd have a much more holistic way of engaging the system and thinking about how we rebuild it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your opening remarks. I think a lot of us are taking notes and really hearing what you're talking about. And to bring this to life a little bit more, I want to note the resources that Subini and Liat are mentioning, most recently the group Sins Invalid. And so as much as I can, I will drop links into the chat for everyone so that you can follow along and pick up some of these links for the important issues being discussed here. So thank you for that. So as a follow-up question, so Subini, you just talked about this intersection of racialization, criminalization, and kind of critical disability frameworks. And so kind of a follow-up question here to both of you is that your scholarship has highlighted how disabled people, past and present, have really resisted this criminalization. And Subini, your book in particular documents this process in very painstaking ways. So folks have resisted criminalization and organized to end their confinements, and Liat's work speaks to this. Can you each elaborate on this and perhaps discuss how your research is connected to each other?
For me, at least, my research comes out of the field of education because I was a special education teacher for 8 years. And I always try to acknowledge that because I think I did a lot of harm in that system, as educators often do, even though we have very good intentions, right? But we are also, and again, that is not a call out of all educators or all special educators. That's not what this is. It's actually about responsibility of teacher education programs and how often they fail educators to bring a critical lens to the classroom to understand the ways our kids experience marginalization in the communities they come from. So for me, understanding racial criminalization came from teaching and watching which kids continually got punished which kids continually got labeled with emotional and behavioral disabilities particularly, and which kids disappeared from my classroom and would tell me that they ended up in a juvenile hall or a youth prison. And I got so interested in it that I then followed them into youth prisons, and I taught in youth prisons for a couple of years and watched what happened there. And so I went, so all of my theorizing comes from direct experience of being an educator and what that was, and what those kids taught me, what Black and brown youth taught me about the ways racism and ableism are interdependent. And also my teacher education program and my education overall, which up until even my graduate program, did not teach me much about those ways of racism and ableism being interdependent. And they didn't have much to say on the overrepresentation of Black and brown youth in special ed. And not even just the overrepresentation, because sometimes special ed gets boiled down to that being the only problem. And the implication there is if we had perfectly proportional representation, then everything would be perfect. And I always really want to push back on that, because even if we had, perfectly proportional representation, if there are 14% of Black kids in school and 14% of Black kids in special ed, it wouldn't change the fact that our outcomes for Black and brown disabled youth are much worse than they are for white disabled youth. And that's because education is built, just like education is built for white children, special education, and I should say formal schooling, not all education, but formal schooling, there's a distinction there, is built for white children. Special education, formalized special education, is built for white disabled children. And so really recognizing how those things link together. I don't know if I answered your question. I kind of started going off on a tangent. So Liat, why don't you jump in here? Because I'm not sure if I really answered the question. So maybe you can get me back on track.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Sure. So, I guess the way I understand the question, which is basically like, hey, do you want to talk about Subini's work? That's how I understood the question. So I'm going to answer it that way. But it probably wasn't the question. So I just want to say, to respond to what you just said, actually, so it's, I really like it as a conversation. I think it's super, super important what you were just saying about how racial pathologization happens and how you've seen it within your work about schooling. Because, of course, our work really builds on the same kind of nexus. And I really love your word nexus, and I'll talk in a moment why I think it's such a helpful concept. But I really think that it happens similarly and differently in different arenas, right? So my arena, of course, it's not schooling per se, but the reason why I talk so much about what I call racial criminal pathologization is because those three things are completely interlinked for me, and I know for you as well. I mean, we can't really talk about criminalization without understanding how people are classified, right? And you're talking about classification within the quote unquote special education system, like you were talking earlier about ED, kids, and what does that mean and how that's a completely racial project. And of course, very gendered. Your work really shows that like so well. And so to me, it's almost like I needed to find a word that it's those three words together. And so I just say the three words together, right? So it's not like my concept, but I really think it's so important to hold those three things together: racialization, criminalization, and pathologization. And it's really important to me also, again, not in the school context, but in the context of the lives of people who are psychiatrized or medicalized, in different ways, because criminalization is only one of the paths that leads people to carcerality and surveillance. And it's so important to note that because then if we don't understand it that way, then we don't understand what's going on in psych facilities. We don't understand, what's going on in nursing homes. We don't understand then what's going on within carceral logics that are not in particular locations. And this is what I get from your work, which again, this is what I understand the question to be, sing the praises, is that this is why, when you talk about the school to prison nexus, and this is, again, I think very clear from your work that you're not at all saying that the school to prison pipeline is not a useful way to talk about it. But I think what nexus brings that is different from pipeline is because the metaphor of the funnel is not useful when we're trying to understand various sites and logics of surveillance and policing and incarceration, of which schools are that. They're not a pipeline to that. They're in fact are that. And I think, building on that work of the nexus, also, like you say in your work, really opens our understanding of knowing and analyzing these processes of surveillance and criminalization and policing spatially. And the way I talk about it in my work is I understand them as logics, right? So they don't necessarily only happen in particular spaces. We have to understand them as logics. And so, that's why I think that both our work really expands on, and other people's work really expands on what the carceral is. And so, in relation to Megan, your question about, people, various sites of confinement and the resistance, I think we're really trying to push what does that look like and what does that mean? Like, yes, it happens in juvies, and yes, it happens in prisons, and Subini does work on juvies and I do work on prisons, but it also absolutely happens elsewhere, and in the sites that we don't often see maybe as carceral, or sites that we don't often talk about as spaces of confinement. And this is something that has been very clear to me from, earlier on work and the anthology that I co-edited, the Disability Incarcerated, which was a very collective process, and all the different examples of what does it mean to understand carcerality of disability in a much more expansive within a way.
Yeah, I would just thank you, Liat. That's super helpful. And the nexus definitely it builds on Erica Miner's, M-E-I-N-E-R-S. It builds on her work. Sorry, my dog is suddenly right next to me. It builds on her work, but it also builds on your work, right? And understanding how the carceral archipelago, right, that Foucault brings up, but also that you really build on, really understanding that, and this is where abolition needs disability justice, because I think a lot of the things that we've set up in society that we think are care work, and I mean care homes, congregate settings, like you said, like when I first started learning about disability justice, of course I didn't think of nursing homes. That's where we go to take care of our elderly people, right? Like that, but then you start understanding the carceral logics that are built into these homes and the pathologizing ways that we treat the patients within. And again, it's not to point out every individual person who works there and say, you're bad. It's about how these logics start getting infused in the ways that we understand the kids or the people inside in this case. So it's so that's part of it for sure for me. So Liat, your work has always been really helpful in understanding the ways that that nexus is implicated. And that nexus idea also comes from, Miners talks about it as a web, right? So it's not this straight line from schools to prison. It's a web of settings that have all been created to take a person who we decide is not worthy of care and concern and to move them out of the public view and into segregated settings. So that web is a really important idea. So one of the things that came up with my students again and again, that Dorothy Roberts, R-O-B-E-R-T-S, that writes about beautifully, and she has a book coming out about it, but is child welfare, right? Is what some people think of as family care, right? And the different things it's named, but how often, right? We know it's extremely racialized. that Black and brown mothers are much more likely to have their children taken away, that it becomes a punitive system where once that really what we're criminalizing is Black and brown poverty, and that once we start criminalizing, those kids get in the system through that child welfare, then how quickly the kids themselves become criminalized and the parents become criminalized. So again, I know Dorothy Roberts has a book coming out about it, but she's also written, I think, a couple of op-eds around it. She's really helped me understand it. So that's been a really big shift for me too.
Thank you both so much for these enriching comments. So kind of related to Liat earlier, you spoke about really centering the margins and really flipping our status quo thinking on its head, right? And starting from the places of folks who are most marginalized in our current systems and societal structures. And so how can we do this? What does this look like for both of you in your work? So how can we bring disabled people of color, disabled queer and trans folks, disabled working class and rural people into our analysis of criminalization, policing, and incarceration? And so you both have touched on this already in your comments so far. What about disabled young people of color? Why are these groups so important for us to center in these conversations? So that's a big question. And if you also want to go there with us, what areas are you both working in currently where these conversations are happening? I think a lot of folks who are probably tuning in to this talk are hungry to hear examples of action, collective action that is taken on these topics, and maybe the networks and conversations that you both are tuned into and in some ways guiding and teaching about in this moment.
Yeah, I just want to say a few things really in short, and then we can kind of develop it more conversationally. Just to, I don't know if it's to amend the question, but the question, how do we bring disabled people of color and disabled queer and trans people and disabled working class people into our analysis of criminalization and policing? I just want to be clear that this is where the analysis comes from. I don't bring them in. I mean, in any shape or form, they bring me in. This is absolutely who the people that I not just share the analysis originates from exactly the people you named. It's people of color, people who have been incarcerated, people who are incarcerated. And by incarcerated, I mean a variety of spaces. It's people that are trans and queer. I mean, this is how I learned about abolition, right? I mean, this is exactly the feminist abolition I'm talking about, comes from, criminalized people, survivors of violence, people who have done transformative justice work based on their involvement, like in all of these formations and oppressions and industries and resistance movements. I mean, this is how I learned to do this work, and this is where this work, I think, originates from. So they don't need me to kind of bring them in. But I do take your question overall, like, very seriously. I really think about this question a lot, about how to kind of on-ramp people, excuse my pun, on-ramp people and to what end, and how to both politicize people and collectivize people. And sometimes those are the same thing, and sometimes they're different. And so these are questions for me, because thinking about politicizing, for example, like I said, for a lot of people, especially young people of color, young disabled people of color, they already, in my familiarity grew up in a world that understood intersectionality from the jump, right? So they don't need me to tell them about that. And this is, of course, completely due to the amazing lineage of people like Kimberly Crenshaw and others who, Beth Ritchie, Insight, INCITE, Insight, Women and Gender Nonconforming People Against Violence. So all these formations that were here before, and then people, read them when they're like 12, and then they come to the work already with an understanding of course, disability justice, of course, intersectionality, of course, and these were not, of course, for us older farts, and so I think that then it becomes a question of politicizing around what, right? So in that sense, I see a lot of my work as a bridge between particularly, okay, within the abolitionist world, do people really understand disability and madness as a political formation? Do they understand the history of disability and madness and neurodiversity? And I say that as a disabled person. I didn't know I have a political identity until I was much older. I was disabled, but I didn't know I was a part of a culture or history or politicized identity or collective or a movement or anything. And so this is what I mean by politicizing people and kind of on-ramping people. Yeah.
I totally agree with Liat. I think the only thing I would add, right, so is that at least working with young people who I work with students, the most common thing is that the students know something is wrong, but the entire education system is built to hide A, what is wrong structurally, B, put it all on their shoulders and make it seem like individual difficulties that they're having, and C, to ignore the ways that their individual behaviors are rooted to a lineage of resistance and rooted to the structural violence they experience. So for me, it's never been about telling them that they are oppressed, right? Young people know they're oppressed. I mean, young people of color, they know that. It's about making sure that they, supporting them in developing the language. And as Liat said, supporting them in developing a political identity, while they're still also trying to get home to take care of their sisters, their siblings, or their nephews and nibblings, whatever it is that they also have to do, supporting them in building that political identity. And again, this generation of young people has way better language than the last. I think it'll just keep advancing. But I do think the one thing is they often don't have adults who support them in that, at least in schools. A lot of times their families do. But in schools, there's a lot of adults who are trying to kind of shield them from that. And again, there are so many great educators who are individually pushing on these. And there's tons of people you could follow on Twitter who are doing this work. Use the hashtag disrupt texts. You can look at Own Voices, another hashtag. So there's just a lot of different educators doing really thoughtful work around this. So it's not all individual educators, but again, when educators aren't politicized, they don't know how to support their students in creating that political identity. And this is especially true, I think, for students in special education, where so often educators are still telling them, you are here because you are broken, you are different, you are deficit, right? And that is so much of my concern is once they get into special ed, then it's all remedial curriculum and relationships based on punishment and surveillance and things like that. So I agree with Liat completely that these folks already have this, and it's actually academics that need to learn from them and to step back and stay out of the way. I think so often we're used to having our voices heard in things like this, right? My voice is getting super amplified. And so I try to, so we have to be really purposeful on not being at the center of everything, particularly in movement work. And that doesn't mean that we don't contribute, but we don't need to be the face of the center of movement work. So I think it's just thinking that through. And then also thinking about how we redistribute the resources we do have from being associated with the university. So for all of us academics that are here, I want us to be thinking about, like, I mean, I'm at Stanford, so I'm basically trying to figure out how to give Stanford's money away, because, you know, and so I hope you all are trying to think about that. Like, how do we redistribute these resources? How do we get access to the university for folks who need the university for legitimacy of their arguments? So I think there's a lot of ways that we can open doors and pass the mic, if you will, instead of pretending these folks don't have voices or don't have commitments to these things already.
Thank you both so much for the wonderful and enlightening responses there. And I apologize if my question was misworded, but I feel as if it was actually a much more productive question to ask, because it drew out those thoughts. And Subini, especially, thank you so much for holding up and shedding a spotlight on our neoliberal capitalist university system that perpetuates these sorts of inequalities and many others that we do not have time to address here, and the role of us as academics who aspire to do abolitionist work in thinking about our place in the university. So Subini, I want to start with you for the next question as well. You co-conceptualized the incredibly helpful framework of Discrit to help us see a lot of the dynamics that we're talking about here today, right? So much of this is about rendering these dynamics visible and putting a name to them so that we can talk about them productively. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about this framework, which helps us to see racialized, criminalizing pathologization, especially as it plays out in in the lives of young people of color, multiply marginalized and disabled people of color. So could you tell us a little bit more about that framework?
Yes, we have a good place for the interpreters to switch. Okay.
Perfect timing.
Yes, yes. Every once in a while, synergy. No, I'm just kidding. That word is silly. So yeah, disability critical race theory, which is what Discrit stands for, came out of my graduate work, where I basically went in thinking about these connections between racism and ableism and how to articulate them. And really, it came out of really trying to understand the overrepresentation of kids of color and Black youth in particular in special education, and really starting to understand that critical race theory I fell in love with immediately and felt so at home in the theory and the writings of Derek Bell and Mari Matsuda, M-A-T-S-U-D-A, and Neil Gotanda, G-O-T-A-N-D-A, and some other folks, right? Kimberly Crenshaw, and just a ton of people. I'll stop naming names because that's just a pain, I'm sure, for the interpreters. But you know, that writing of really understanding racism as something that's not individual acts, not simply aberrant, but it's something that happens all of the time, that it is a normal, everyday occurrences, was mind-blowing for me. I just never had the language before. And I started looking at it, but felt really like there was nothing being said about disability and ableism. And then I found disability studies through David Connor's work and other people's work. Especially, I just want to shout out, if you haven't read Nirmala Eravallis, E-R-E-V-E-L-L-E-S. Nirmala Eravallis's work has just, her work was just amazing to me. She was putting together these ideas. So there are critical folks, and there's many, many more, and I try to cite them often, but I just, for honoring people's time, they were really bringing in disability. Yes, exactly, Liat. They were really bringing in critical ideas around disability. And some of those folks, especially Nirmala, were bringing ideas of disability and race in, but we were still just kind of grappling with how to bring them together. Because again, critical race theory, missing disability and ableism, and disability studies, for the most part, being very white centered. So, you know, Chris Bell talked about it as white disability studies. So the two of them, trying to bring the two of them into conversation, really to make sense of how, as people of color, and again, not just first just people of color, not disabled people of color, but people of color are automatically seen as less than. And we talk about this all the time in racism. When we talk about racism, we talk about being seen as less than, being seen as deficit, being seen, you know, model minority stereotype that Asian folks are subjected to. All of those are forms of ableism, but we're not naming them as ableism. And that was really, and so really trying to get to be able to name those, and then recognizing disabled people of color are facing even more extreme versions of ableism and racism combined, and that the two are interdependent, that as soon as you read somebody as raced, that then society sees them as less than in thinking, in behavior, and in productivity, as T.L. Lewis and Dustin Gibson would say. Right, so it's that understanding that racism and ableism are so connected, and Liat's work again really helped me understand that as well, and how then that difference, that deficit, which I talk about as ableism, and that leaning on racism gives people permission to criminalize, or what I talk about as pathologize. And so that pathologization, when I talked to kids about it in schools, they talked about three major constructs, right? Labeling, surveillance, and punishment. And the three are all, so we talked about it as a cycle. And it didn't mean that they always entered in one spot. They could enter in any of the three places. But once they were there, they got caught in a cycle of what I called pathologization. And I called it a pedagogy of pathologization, because it was constantly about teaching them that it was their fault that they were in this cycle. It was about teaching kids of color, and particularly in this case, girls of color, that they were responsible for their own issues, and particularly incarcerated girls, while totally ignoring the structures that got them incarcerated and that built criminal identities before they had ever committed crimes.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Liat, I didn't know if you wanted to chime in there. I know that much of what was exciting to you about the event today was really being in conversation with Subini and her work. And so I wondered if you wanted to respond at all in terms of how the Discrit framework has shaped your thinking and your own work, if you want to add anything to that.
I'm happy to, just to be mindful of time. I don't know if you want to incorporate any kind of another question, but
Sure.
I'm definitely holding that question. I have a lot, yeah, I have a bunch to say.
Wonderful. Well, our last question, which you may or may not want to engage with, and we can keep it short, is just kind of a policy and action question. And you both have touched on this a little bit, so I'm just here kind of asking to see if you want to elaborate at all around how we can think about applying and using abolitionist thinking and principles and critical disability perspectives and concepts to push for equity in public policy. Is that even the right question from an abolitionist framework, first of all? And then second of all, if that is a valid question, how can those of us who are working in the fields of education, social work, I see a couple questions that we definitely want to get to from folks working in social work, folks working within and outside of the justice system, and related fields, these fields of care and control that we've been talking about, where can we take abolitionist thinking and apply pressure to public policy? And so one example that I'll throw out from my own work, just to kind of get us thinking about this if we want to engage with it, is a lot of my work is around homelessness and housing insecurity. And so all the intersections of injustice and marginalization are laid bare for people experiencing homelessness, and especially folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And Liat, you mentioned earlier, you know, that we can't social work our way out of the problem either, right? That in many ways, when we shift the conversation from policing to any sort of coercive social service provision, we are replicating the same coercive therapeutic logic that we started with. And so do either of you want to add anything to any of the conversations that you're currently engaged in around change and how we can pursue it?
Sure. So I will kind of take both of those questions together real quick, because I know we're running out of time and we want to open it up. And just to say that, you know, to Subini, you know, one thing that I want to push on a little bit is just the kind of the framework, and I think it depends on the historicization and lineage of disability studies, like how far back we go, and also what we think disability studies is. So this whole notion of like disability studies being white, I think is correct if we look at like what people find to be canonical disability studies, but not so much if you just read like people like Dorothy Roberts or you know, or other people, and then are like, okay, this is disability studies about trauma of people of color, you know, and then why don't we do that, right? Like, and
why isn't it brought into those canonical spaces, right? I totally agree. Sorry, Liat, I didn't mean that. I just was like over here muted and snapping.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm not blaming you. I know you know that, and I know that's how you teach. This is more like a kind of a general comment, and to say that, you know, our conceptualizations of disability studies, of course, bringing in stuff into disability studies, and came exactly from these places that, why don't we call them disability studies? Like, I think that really is the question. And so, you know, discrit and racial criminal pathologization, and, you know, of course, also come from understanding of eugenics, and that's something that's very much in disability studies. But what I think is missing, and this is related to Megan's second question, is we still don't have a very good analysis, although the kind of newer generation, shout out to Gina Kim, for example, Gina with a J, Kim, and other people who are much more grappling with the question of state violence. So this is a question that within disability studies and disability spaces, I am not sure that we're completely like immersed in. And to me, the question of state violence is kind of where we're at right now, and why we need these conceptualization like discrit, I think are very helpful to understanding that, and of course abolition. And the reason why is because, of course, if we understand institutionalization, for example, as state violence, it's not just ableism. Yes, it's ableism, but it's also a form of state violence, something that tries to kill us, you know, get rid of us, like in very particular ways, and in ways that are very long, have a very long lineage. Then I think we would have a different analysis and a different formation for liberation around it as well. The kind of alliances then that we can make would be quite different if we are rooted in that framework. And so to me, Megan, your question is, yes, I don't have anything, I don't think it's the wrong question. I don't have anything against public policy. And, to me, this is what abolitionists often grapple with, non-reformist reforms, right? Like what is a reform? What is a form of abolition? And I don't really have time to get into it, but to me, this is a question about like, what is your goal? And then what are the means? And then how do we collectively decide how to get there? And I really recommend, Dean Spade's work and Miriam Kaba, K-A-B-A. Thank you.
It just happens to be next to me, so.
Also, work about this question. I think it's an empirical question. It's a question that we answer by doing. It's not a question that we can know in advance. And like Subini said at the beginning, abolition is a project of dismantling and of building, which is, something Ruthie Gilmore, like you said, always says. But it's really important that we don't forget the dismantling too, and the building too, right? So, yeah, I'll just stop there.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, Liat, and I agree, by the way, you really named like what we think of disability studies, and that was my concern when I was introduced to it, was a very narrow range of what disability studies was, canonical texts. And not that those texts don't mean anything and that they're not important, but again, they almost always centered, the white disabled person as the center of that work. And so to me, it did not speak to the experiences of my students. And that's again, who I write for, our Black and brown youth. As far as how we make change, I think a lot of it has to do with how we, where we enter. So like one of the things I try to remind people is like, everybody here has expertise that I don't have. Everybody here knows something I do not know. You have a specialty I do not have. And I don't just mean academics. You all just have a skill set because you've lived a life I have not lived. So I want you to enter where your expertise is and think about how you change that point in the system. Like if we all put our hands on something in the system and start shifting, then maybe we can make change. So yes, we need to defund and abolish the police. But if that isn't where you've always worked, maybe that's not the place you jump into. I want you to understand that. And I do say that the one thing that's the ways that I think ideas get misappropriated is when we get too far from the original. So like, I do want people to understand what happens in youth prisons. I can get concerned, or adult prisons. I get concerned that abolition has in some ways been taken up to like not understand that. So I do think we need that. But I also think like you don't have to jump into youth prisons if that's not your focus. You know what I mean? Like if your focus is social work, then get in there. If your focus is homelessness, as Megan's is, then get in there, which I'm clearly she's doing already. So like, I just think that there's so many things right at our fingertips. It's kind of that very old book, but Beverly Tatum talked about the sphere of influence and like, what's your sphere of influence and how do you then shift it? Makes a lot more sense than trying to jump in front of a new idea. And Miriam Kaba, the person we keep referring to, K-A-B-A, she continually says, if you are interested in something new, look around and see who's already doing it and then go learn from them. So we don't start a new thing because we've suddenly discovered it. Chances are someone's been working on it for years. So again, I think part of the abolitionist imaginary, right, which is this beautiful thing about what we can build, has to be, look what's already being built. Look what's already being put towards taking down the system that you've just discovered. Because again, so many folks are doing the work, who have been doing the work. And that's, I think, why Liat and I are so set on naming those people that we learned from and naming each other, because I think we learn from each other. And I always want to like be so generous with the way I cite, not only on paper, but in these conversations, because the distributed knowledge is so much better than one person at the lead. It just makes me a better person that I've learned from so many of these people.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. So in the interest of time, we're going to turn now to questions from the audience. And so a couple folks have asked some interesting questions. Well, here's a quick one for you, Subini. can you give an example of how special education is created for white disabled children?
Oh, how much time do you have?
As much time as it takes.
I'm just kidding. Sorry. It's a fair question, right? Because this is part of how white supremacy works, is it's not out there going, this is for white kids only, right? But it is, I mean, if you even know the history of how special education has happened, right? Like there is the fight for special ed, and I never want to denigrate the fight that parents and other people went through to make sure that disabled kids no longer had to go to separate schools, right? Or at least the majority of them, which again, is kind of true today. But I want to honor that fight that led to 504 and education of the what is now IDEA, right? Those are really important fights. And the minute they were taken up, so like if you start thinking about like 1975, when IDEA was, the first iteration of it was put into effect, what else was happening? Does anyone remember? Okay, this isn't a class, so I can't actually ask you that question, but it was happening right during the desegregation fight post Brown versus Board, right? Even though Brown versus Board was made in 1954, the second Brown versus Board had to come, and states were fighting it for decades. So by 1975, immediately as special ed became part of public schools, guess what happened? An overrepresentation of Black and brown youth. Special ed has never not had that, right? As long as historically it's been around, that's been the history. If you look at Dunn's early work, I mean, you can see it from the early 70s on. And if you look at Sleeter, Sleeter, she has a really interesting thing about how the category of learning disabilities was created. Learning disabilities was created, according to Sleeter, because there were white parents did not want their kids in what is now known as cognitively disabled places. So because there were too many Black and brown kids there, and they knew that their opportunities got taken away. So they changed the cutoff line, and then they created a new category called learning disabilities. Over time, learning disabilities has now been populated by Black and brown kids. So guess what? Now we have autism. They actually called autism the white island. Like that's how it's referred to, because it's so populated by white children. And think about what you need to get an autism diagnosis, right? You need to be able to access a doctor, not just a school team, like emotional disability, learning disability, those general disabilities, even cognitive disabled, intellectual disability. You have to then, you have to go to an actual doctor. So that means you have to have health insurance. You have to have a parent who can get you there. You have to have all these things in order to get, to have somebody labeled with autism. So that's just one example of the history of how special ed's always kind of been created for white children.
Thank you so much. Our next question is about disepistemology. So Liat, perhaps you would want to start us off. So Jenna writes that your idea of abolition disepistemology is really powerful. I definitely understand the need to let go of a definitive view of what the future holds, especially considering the immense amount of violence that institutions introduce. But I feel myself pushing up against the idea of letting go of optimism. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that. The prison industrial complex and medical industrial complex are so violent, and to get rid of them would be a huge win, in that throwing people away would no longer be our first response. Even if nothing else changes, and this is not at all my view of abolition, I'd like a lot more to change. It seems like we'd be in a better world, which seems like something to be optimistic about. Would you be able to speak more about this aspect of disepistemology?
Yes. So thank you for that question. So I know we don't have like a lot of time, so I'm happy to also talk about it after. But I would just say, that this comes from an understanding of affect, AFFECT, that doesn't just pits, kind of feelings or affective reactions against each other. meaning the opposite of optimism is not like depression or nothing or something like that. So what I try to say about optimism is that we shouldn't kind of follow this idea, and this critique really comes from, you know, queer theory, especially queer theory that's anchored in Black and brown knowledge. Particularly, I'm thinking of Jose Munoz, M-U-N-O-Z, work, Cruising Utopia. So I am thinking about abolition as utopian, for example, right? But I'm trying to kind of recover utopia from it being, oh, something we cannot do, something only quote unquote crockpots do, right? To kind of reclaim madness, to reclaim, you know, what is possible and not possible. So in that sense, the kind of optimism that I object to is the kind of optimism that says it will get better. And we know from critiques of that particular campaign, which was a very gay campaign, but not very queer one, is that it gets better for people for whom things usually get better. And, you know, we live in COVID. I mean, I think that made it, if nothing else, that for sure made it super clear, right? That the specter of white supremacy was the precondition, as Kimberly Crenshaw says. She calls it disaster white supremacy as the moment of COVID, that it made things apparent that were maybe behind the curtain before then, at least for some people. So this idea of optimism is often rooted in a very racialized notion of hierarchies and what and for whom things get better. I know that's not what kind of you were asking, but this is where I'm kind of coming from in my critique of that type of optimism. And it's basically to say we need to anchor our knowledge, our epistemology in Black and brown knowledges of people who are incarcerated, mad, disabled, chronically ill, that have a different way of being in the world that doesn't correspond to that kind of productivity, linearity, progress, getting better. What if we don't get better? And maybe that's fine. So that's what I'm talking against.
Wonderful, thank you. Subini, I see you smiling over there. Would you like to chime in?
No, I'm just really glad I'm here. This is the way I needed to end today. So I'm just really glad I'm here. I'm
Likewise,
smiling.
we are glad you're here as well.
I am smiling because Liat, you continue to just be who you are. Thank you for that.
Well, in the interest of time, we are going to wrap up shortly. And so I wanted to ask our wonderful, amazing panelists if they have any closing thoughts that they would like to leave us with, anything that's kind of at the top of your mind that you want to share, something you've been thinking about during this time. I'll turn it over to you one last time.
I think the only thing I would add is how we need to continually think about building solidarity coalitions, and that takes two. I think we both have to be thinking of how we work on ourselves individually and what we perpetuate and what we do, but then also how we move towards changing structures, and we only do that by building coalitions. And watching today unfold with Asian women being murdered last night by a mass shooter, I've just been thinking a lot about Black and Asian solidarity and that, and also and disability solidarity, because all of that matters. And I want to say disability solidarity as disabled people of color solidarity. And so really thinking about how we work across lines and how we think past, how we think with particular identities of ours, and then also how we think through them and think of our solidarity. Alexis Pauline Gumbs, G-U-M-B-S, talked about women of color, like the term is a political term, right? It's not an identity so much. Women of color was originally created by Loretta Ross and some other folks, other women who are thinking through this idea of what does it mean to be in solidarity with each other. And so taking that term back to its political roots and how we think about building with each other and how we think about building across coalitions, right? And so like as somebody who's both part of the Asian and Black community, you know, one of the things that seemed to be happening, right, when a lot of the anti-Asian violence started this year, I don't mean always, but when it started this year, was kind of a response of, oh, well, look at the Black people doing this to Asian people. Really, when it wasn't that Black people were attacking Asian people anymore, white people certainly were. They're coughing on them and yelling Kung Flu and all these horrible things. But we know what gets picked up by the media, right? And part of that is to sow division between us. And so one of the things I want us to think about as Asian folks is how do we be in community and recognize our struggle? We don't need to erase it, but we also can't be anti-Black in our solutions to it. And so like constantly thinking about that, right? We don't want to, you know, and we have to think about across lines all the time. So we don't want to be ableist in our solutions to carceral logics, right? And so if we're continually thinking about what that means and talking to people about what that means and not be afraid of getting it wrong, you know, but having the conversation, listening, being told, no, you're wrong, and not turning it into a, oh, poor me, I've made a mistake, and just, whoops, sorry about that, let's move on, right? Like, how do we have those conversations? Because that is what happens in coalition building, is that we get it wrong and we have to figure out how to grow past it. So I just think that's, especially after today, I'm thinking a lot about how we are in solidarity with each other.
Yeah, thank you. I want to also kind of end with that, thinking about, I mean, I hope that this was clear for kind of newbies that we're hoping to on-ramp, is that disability, the framework of disability justice is incredibly intersectional, anti-capitalistic, cross kind of coalitional framework across kind of across oppressions, learning from each other's resistance, being in solidarity. It's a framework that, of course, like Subini was saying at the beginning, came from particularly people of color and queer, disabled, mad people of color. And I hope that it's clear that disability justice, because we didn't give definitions, this is the teacher in me, disability justice is not disability plus justice. I've seen that happening. And disability studies is not the study of disability. And these are frameworks that come from particular lived knowledges and critical knowledges. And it's really important to learn what these actually mean and kind of grow with that knowledge. And so through that framework, I absolutely think it leads us to the kind of solidarities with Asian people, with Palestine, with, you know, global internationalist, not just solidarity movements, but anti-imperialist struggles that I don't think are really embedded in a lot of disability rights movements. But it's really important for me that people understand that disability justice is not disability plus justice. And read the principles that Subini mentioned. And I just want to end by saying that this is exactly what we mean by racial pathologization. Both Subini and myself, and you know, a lot of people who write about this. You know, when we talk about the Kung Flu, the yellow peril, right? I mean, these are not like new thing. This Spanish flu. Not Spanish, by the way. These are racist terms that get attached to particular formation that are either kind of biological. It's a rhetorical warfare, right? That it is a racial project. So I'm having a hard time understanding how people don't see the connection between racialization and pathologization in those ways. So it's beyond just let's fight with each other as allies or something like that. But it's really understanding that it's interconnected. We can disrupt pathologization without disrupting this, without disrupting anti-Asian hatred, connected to a virus. I mean, how is that not a disability project? It's beyond me, and vice versa. So to me, that's a core. That's not like something we do in addition to like other stuff. I mean, that's the core.
Yeah, the only
Wonderful.
thing I would add,
Oh, go for it.
sorry, the only thing I would add is just read Liat's new book. I want to just point that out, that this is a new book about decarcerating disability, and the way, the interventions that this book makes that builds on the previous work she's already done with the edited book, I think is really gonna shift the way some people think about abolition. So get yourself some knowledge.
And also,
can't-
I just want to say that if people can't afford the book, please contact me, and I'm happy to send it for free.
That is so amazing. Well, thank you both so much. Please, let's do the cheesy virtual applause or whatever your own version of that is in your own spaces. Please, let's thank Dr. Annamma and Dr. Ben-Moshe for being so gracious with their time, with their knowledge. I can't speak for everyone else, but I feel so inspired and enlightened, and I am seeing so many notes in the chat that are reiterating these points. So thank you both so much. Thank everyone for attending and folks who pulled this event off for us. And thank you. Have a great rest of your evening wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.